AP Government people, this is it. My final exam review for the upcoming test. I am breaking down many things that you will see on your test. So please make sure you pay special attention to this video, especially the things that are bolded. And I encourage you to download the PowerPoint and the fill-in-the-blank guide that can be found at apgovreview.com and in the description below. Before we begin, I want to give you a reminder about this test and every other test you will ever take in your life. Best of luck. You are brilliant and will do great, but never ever forget that you are always more than a test score. It does not define who you are as a human being. You are a wonderful human being with or without this test. But you're going to rock this test, so let's get going. All right, start off talking about the Constitution, and you need to know some influences of the Constitution. You have the Enlightenment, people like John Locke, who talked about natural rights, and Montesquieu, who advocated separation of power. Articles of Confederation, that was the very first governing document, and that created a very weak central government. That did not last long at all. Shays' Rebellion occurred under the Articles of Confederation. This demonstrated the weakness of the Articles because there was not a strong government that was able to keep order. There was no national military that was able to put down this rebellion of Massachusetts farmers against state taxes. So definitely know that Shays' Rebellion was a contributor to the Constitution. Let's talk about separation of powers. Montesquieu, again, is kind of the father of this, or credited with this idea. And this kind of divides responsibility between branches. Now, some examples, and you will need to know them. Congress can declare war and create laws, but the president is commander-in-chief, and he or she enforces laws. Now, this wall of separation is not found in the Constitution. It's more of an idea really advocated by Thomas Jefferson. And this is really the idea that we get of separation of church and state. So religion and government is separated. All right, let's talk about checks and balances. What is the purpose? To keep one branch from becoming too powerful. You absolutely positively have to know examples. You will see some probably on the multiple choice portion of your test. So take a minute and check out this sweet picture that I created of different checks and balances. You got Lincoln over here representing the executive branch, my boy Salmon P. Chase representing the judicial branch, and of course none other than Henry Clay representing the legislative branch. Follow the link in the description to download this as well. Make sure you know these. I can almost guarantee you'll see a multiple choice question on checks and balances. So it must involve two branches, and this sounds simple, but for example, the Supreme Court overturning a lower court decision is not an example. That's only one branch. So Congress impeaching the president is an example. Remember, impeachment does not mean removing from office. Impeachment means bringing charges against an official. The Senate can confirm a Supreme Court justice with a simple majority of 51 senators voting in favor. That's another example of checks and balances. And the Supreme Court cannot, I repeat, cannot declare an amendment unconstitutional. That is not an example of checks and balances. The Supreme Court can do nothing about amendments because that's built into the Constitution. And if Congress disagrees with a court decision, the only solution, at least from their perspective, is to create an amendment because what the Supreme Court says goes in regards to that law. All right, let's talk about federalism. It will absolutely be on your test, and is the division of power between the federal or the national and state governments. Now, the 10th Amendment, this is what really creates federalism. And this states that powers not given to the national government are reserved for the states. Make sure you know the 10th Amendment. Now, the elastic clause in the Constitution, this allows the federal government to make laws that are necessary and proper. And our boy Alexander Hamilton, this is the argument he's going to use when he creates the Bank of the United States. Now, often the elastic clause and the 10th Amendment are kind of in competition with each other because the elastic clause is taking a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and some could argue is infringing on the 10th Amendment rights. And often the federal government and states, they share powers, and this is known as cooperative federalism. Make sure you know this. An example of that is law enforcement. You have law enforcement on a local and state level as well as a national level. Now, devolution, definitely know this bad boy. This is giving powers back to state governments, and this really became popular under Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. Now, grants, when you see grants, this is a form of federalism, and you could very well see multiple choice questions on this, or even your free response portion as well. Categorical grants are project-based. They're based on an application. And by the way, when you see a bold again, make sure you know it. Maybe create a flashcard about it or something, because the chances of you seeing these bolded terms on your test is very, very high. Formula grants, this is money that is distributed based on a formula. There's no application for this. An example of this is Medicaid. So if a person meets the requirements for that, then they will automatically get it from the federal government. Now, block grants is money that is given with discretion to states with how to spend. So states have more leeway when it comes to these grants from the federal government. And if you're a state, you're going to favor a block grant because you get to choose how that money is spent. The federal government is not giving you a mandate on it. And a mandate is a requirement for states by the federal government, things you have to do. An example of this is the Americans with Disabilities Act, signed by George H.W. Bush, in which the federal government required states to comply with this new law. Federalism can also lead to diverse policies throughout the United States, whether it's from education and gun laws. That's why these laws may vary from state to state. They have different education laws and they have different gun laws. And that's due to federalism and this idea of reserved powers or states being able to make up their mind. Okay, miscellaneous Constitution stuff. What is the primary responsibility of the Constitution when it was created? To protect private property. Now, voting requirements were left up to the states, and this is why in the South you see the development of poll taxes and literacy tests. So states decide how voting often takes place, whether it is a closed primary or an open primary, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Now, citizens today directly only vote for 1/3 of our government, and that is the House members and the senators. And originally, we only voted for the House. It wasn't until the 17th Amendment that Americans began to vote for their senators. We do not elect the president. That is the Electoral College, and we do not have anything to do with the selection of chief justices other than we vote for the president who could appoint them. And again, the Electoral College elects the president. Now, the Commerce Clause, this is part of the Constitution, and this regulates commerce with foreign nations and states. This is the federal government that does this, so that increases the power of the federal government over time. Absolutely be able to identify that. When it comes to amending the Constitution, this is both a state and national government practice. And this is an example of that federal structure of government. Theories of government ratification. Let's go to the early theories of government. We have pluralism, and know all three of these. This is the belief that groups, like interest groups, can influence public policy through organizations, whether it's the National Rifle Association, the National Organization for Women, which saw a primary member be this woman, Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique, a very influential woman from the 1960s, or even the United Auto Workers. So pluralism argues that it's good to have a lot of different interest groups or factions or groups in general because they can help influence policy. Now, elitism, this is the belief that society is separated into the wealthy and the non-wealthy, or the haves and have-nots. And really, it's the wealthy who have all the power, and they're the ones that make decisions in politics because they can influence politics with their money. Hyperpluralism is kind of the opposite approach of pluralism, and they say, listen, there's too many groups competing with each other, that government is weakened and gridlocked often. So there's too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. When you see Federalists and Anti-Federalists, this revolves around the debate over whether to ratify the Constitution. And they debated over the size and scope of the national government under the Constitution. And in Federalist 10, which is a part of the 85 Federalist Papers written by John Jay, James Madison here, and another one of my boys, Alexander Hamilton, the purpose of those was to try to persuade New York to ratify the Constitution. The Federalist Papers are great insight to how the framers of the Constitution thought. And in Federalist number 10, James Madison argued that this was about factions and controlling factions. And factions are undesirable, but they are inevitable in a large republic. Okay, Electoral College, what is it? It is what actually elects the president. You don't when you vote for the president. The Electoral College does. Now, in 48 states, every single state except for Maine and Nebraska, the candidate that wins the popular vote wins all of the electoral votes. It's a winner-take-all system. Absolutely know this. So, for example, in New York State, if candidate A receives 51% of the vote and candidate B receives 49% of the vote, candidate A receives all of the electoral votes. That's how it works. So when you go and you vote on Election Day in November, you are voting to determine which person will get all of the electoral votes in that state unless you're living in Maine or Nebraska. So what are the implications of the Electoral College? Know this for multiple choice questions. Well, large in terms of population, states and swing states, they get the most attention. So let's take a look at the electoral votes per state. States like California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. These are the largest ones. And Ohio is considered a swing state. They're not committed to one party or another from election to election. So one election they may vote Democratic, the next election they may vote Republican. So when presidential elections occur, you see lots of campaigning in Ohio for this reason. If you are a swing state, your state will gather a lot of attention. And if no one receives a majority of electoral votes, and it is currently at 270 as the majority, then the House decides the election. This is according to the 12th Amendment, with each state getting one equal vote. And this really encourages a two-party system. I can't stress this enough. The Electoral College encourages a two-party system. So when it comes to primaries, there's a couple different primaries that you need to know. And these are elections that candidates run in to get the nomination for their party. Now, if it is an open primary, voters are not required to register with a party to vote in that primary. If it is a closed primary, only voters register with a party can vote in a primary. Now, I live in New York. Guess what? It is a closed primary. So if I want to vote in a presidential primary, I have to register with either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party in order to vote. So closed primaries, you will see fewer people voting usually than in open primaries. If you hear the phrase a majority election, this means that the candidate must receive more than half the votes. Again, the Electoral College is an example of this at 270 votes needed. If you see plurality election, this means that a candidate can win without receiving a majority, but rather they receive the most votes. And this can happen when more than two candidates run. So plurality election, again, is when a candidate receives the most votes, but they do not receive a majority. And this happened in 1860, in 1968 with Richard Nixon, and in 1992 with Bill Clinton. And in recent years, we have frequently had a divided government. Divided government is a very important concept that has been on many, many past AP government exams. And this is the idea that Congress and the presidency are controlled by different parties. So for example, Congress could be controlled by Democrats and the president is a Republican. That's an example of divided government when you have opposing political parties in control. Now, speaking of political parties, we have the Democrats here and the Republicans over on the right. There is no mention of political parties in the Constitution. And parties have national, state, and local offices. Your county probably has an office. Your state absolutely does. And of course, the national government does. And really, these offices are often separate and independent. They have different goals and desires. In recent years, more and more Americans have been identifying with neither party. So really, it is becoming more common for Americans not to be registered as Democrats or Republicans. Definitely know that. All right, jumping on over to interest groups. What are they? They are groups that seek to influence public policy. So what are some examples? Well, I've mentioned them already. You have the NRA, the National Rifle Association, the American Association for Retired People, or the National Education Association. These are different interest groups. And how do they influence public policy? They do so by especially lobbying. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., walk down K Street. You will see that is really where all the lobbyists hang out. That's where their offices are, and you will see them there in Washington. They also can write laws to give to legislators to propose laws, and they also provide legislators with key information. They are really almost experts in their area. So how are interest groups different from political parties? Absolutely, positively know how to identify this. They do not nominate candidates. Interest groups do not nominate candidates. They support candidates, but they don't nominate them. What they do have in common with political parties is that they are linkage institutions. And a linkage institution is something that links the public to the political process. So interest groups and political parties are a way to connect the public, the American public, to the political process. Other examples include media, elections, and of course, political parties. Please be able to identify the different linkage institutions. I would make a flashcard of that if I were you to study to make sure. All right, political action committees has appeared on virtually every single AP Gov exam. What are they? They are a committee that donates money to a candidate in a political party. And the limit is $5,000 per candidate per election. One for primary, one for general. So the most a PAC can give to a candidate in any one single year is $10,000. And that's only if they have a primary and a general election. Now, individuals cannot donate more than $5,000 to a single PAC per year. You can give money to lots of PACs, but only $5,000 per PAC. And who do PACs donate money to? To candidates that are favorable to their issues. So if you see political action committees or PACs, the answer is going to be something about fundraising money or donating money to a candidate. Political socialization and beliefs will also be on your test. What is socialization? That is how individuals learn about politics. And the most common form by far is from family. Notice it's not a picture of me. This is some like dude living in West Virginia in the 1960s and his family. Chances are his 3 little kids will grow up having similar or identical beliefs to their father. That is political socialization. Now, a political belief by Americans is that most Americans support equality or equal opportunity, but they overwhelmingly do not support economic equality. You could see a question. All the following are beliefs of Americans except, and that except will be they do not support economic equality. More Americans have distrusted the government, and that distrust is increasing since the 1960s, and we'll talk about why later. All right, political behavior. You have to know how certain people vote. Young people under 30, they do not typically vote in large numbers. They are one of the smallest turnout groups there is. Even after lowering the voting age to 18, and this happened in the 26th Amendment, 18 to 21-year-olds still voted less than others. Very important to know, absolutely be able to recognize that. The older an individual is and the more educated they are, the more likely they are to vote. So age and education are a correlation with voting. African Americans tend to vote Democratic. Absolutely know that, and that changed with FDR and the New Deal. We'll come back to that. And beginning in 1968 and continuing through today, and especially in the 1980s, most Southern whites vote Republican. So if you look down here, this is the election of 1968. You see Nixon winning several states in the South that used to be called the Solid South because they overwhelmingly voted Democratic. Party identification plays a significant role in how an individual will vote in a presidential election and a congressional election. What I mean is, if a person is a Democrat, then chances are they will vote for a president that is a Democrat and a congressperson who is a Democrat as well. Ticket splitting is the idea that you vote for different party members for different offices. So, for example, you may vote the president as a Democrat, but your House of Representative member you would vote as a Republican. That is an example of ticket splitting. Definitely know that this has increased in recent years. Absolutely know that. Again, if it's bold, the chances of you seeing this on your exam are very, very high. I promise you. Okay, political participation, public opinion. The most common form of political participation is voting in presidential elections. However, most Americans, more than 50% of Americans, do not even vote in most elections. Comparing that with other democracies of the world, we have a much lower turnout rate in the United States. So be able to identify that we continue to vote in lower ratios than other democracies. Political efficacy is tied into that. And that's the belief that an individual can make an impact on the political process. If you believe your vote matters, you're more likely to vote than if you believe your vote doesn't matter. Okay, media and iron triangles. Most media outlets focus on day-to-day activities of presidential candidates. They do not focus on the platform of candidates, but rather on the day-to-day activities and campaigns. In recent years, media outlets have been controlled by fewer companies. So you see one company may be owning 3 or 4 newspapers in different cities. This leads to fewer companies controlling and ultimately deciding what appears on the news. Horse race journalism is a term you should be familiar with, and this is the idea that the media focuses on polls rather than the issues. So the news station may lead with the news on who is number 1 in the current polls and is likely to be president, but they may not talk about that person's political issues. And an iron triangle is something that has appeared multiple times on past exams, and this is Congress, interest groups, and the bureaucracy or government agencies. You have to see all 3. So it's Congress interacting with interest groups, interacting with the bureaucracy or a government agency. Absolutely know that. I have a video in the description that describes this more, but be able to recognize these 3 groups are key. The president is a part of the iron triangle, and neither is the Supreme Court. Here is the Capitol building located in Washington, D.C. Legislation, making laws. It's long, it's difficult to pass, and it relies often on compromise. And most bills that are introduced do not become laws. Not only do they not become laws, but they don't even get to the whole Congress to even vote on. They die in committee. So go watch the Schoolhouse Rock. I'm Just a Bill. It does a great job talking about this. Incumbency is incredibly important to understand that if you're an incumbent or you already have the seat that you are running for, that is a huge predictor of success in congressional elections. So House incumbents overwhelmingly win elections. It's very difficult to unseat a House of Representatives member. This is one of the biggest predictors of an election outcome, is who is the incumbent. Now, it is important in Senate elections, but not nearly as important as in House elections. Now, the reason why incumbents usually win is they receive more contributions, they have name recognition, and they use something called the franking privilege. And this allows them to send things in the mail free of charge to their constituents. So if I am a member of the House of Representatives, I can send anything I want to all my constituents free of charge. And they can also cite services that were provided to constituents. So for example, if I live in Iowa and I'm on an agricultural committee, I could tell my constituents, this is what I got for you living here in Iowa. And that's often referred to as pork barrel, or special allocation of federal funds to constituents. Now, Congress can declare war, they can appropriate money, and they can also oversee government agencies or the bureaucracy. And they can create new courts and more judges. And they can also override presidential vetoes, which requires 2/3 of both houses to do so. Now, Congress can allow the president to take the lead in federal policy areas, and they do so often. Now, congressional oversight is an important term you need to know. This is the idea that Congress reviews an agency, a department, or even an office. So some examples, they could set guidelines for an agency and telling them what they have to do. They can hold hearings, and if you've ever turned on C-SPAN, you've probably seen a hearing where they're grilling maybe the head of a department. And most importantly, they can allocate funding. They can give more or less funding to a government agency. So if they don't feel a government agency is doing a good job, they could take that funding away. No getting around it. You have to know congressional committees. Make flashcards if you need to. Committees are much more significant in the House than they are in the Senate. There are more members, and committees can do more work than the whole House. There are 435 members of the House. So it's important to assign bills to committees before they go to vote in the whole House. Now, standing committees, these are permanent committees. Things like foreign relations or agriculture. Committees that will be there from one session of Congress to the next. And members of committees tend to be experts in that area. If you are a member of the Agricultural Committee, chances are you are not going to be from, I don't know, what's an area that doesn't have a lot of agriculture? Alaska, perhaps? Conference committees they help settle differences between bills passed in both houses. So the House of Representatives may have a different version of a bill than the Senate. And the conference committee is what will help settle those differences. Rules Committee is only in the House of Representatives, and this determines the rules for bills, the date that it will be on the floor, the time allowed for the debate about the bill, and then whether or not any amendments are allowed. Now, no, if there is a closed rule, this means there are set time limits and no amendments or changes to the bill is allowed. Therefore, if it's open, there are looser time limits and amendments are allowed. So absolutely no closed rule versus open rule when it comes to the House of Representatives. Subcommittees are created by committees to investigate or research a specific issue, and they report back to the whole committee. So subcommittee is a committee within a committee. Committee chairs, they become less influential in recent years. And in the House, committee chairs are members of the majority party. Now, the Ways and Means, this is the House Committee. This is the Economic Committee. This deals with taxation, tariffs, anything dealing with money is the House Ways and Means. This is a very important, very powerful committee. If a member serves on this committee, they cannot serve on another. So you are one and done if you are on the House Ways and Means. So let's get into the House of Representatives. What are some special powers that they have? Be able to identify them. They can impeach officials, and here are 2 presidents that have been impeached. Andrew Johnson, and Bill Clinton. Remember, impeach does not mean to be removed from office. That could be an outcome of it. It means to bring charges against an official. Revenue bills, anything dealing with taxation or tariffs, that must originate in the House of Representatives. They cannot start in the Senate according to the Constitution. Again, there are 435 members, and this is based on population. So your number of House of Representatives in each state can change every 10 years when the census is taken. And districts are determined by state legislatures. State legislatures draw the congressional districts within that state. I can't stress how important it is to be able to identify that. It is not a federal thing that draws congressional districts. It is a state legislature duty. And gerrymandering, this is the idea of drawing congressional boundaries that are favorable to a party in control. So if the Democrats are in control of New York State, and the congressional districts are changing based on population, then they get to draw what the new districts will be. Here is one of the political cartoons that talked about, that illustrated this idea of gerrymandering. So sometimes political parties will want to try to create districts that will overwhelmingly vote in support for that political party. In the House of Representatives, rules of procedure are more formal than they are in the Senate. In a closed rule for a bill, again, amendments cannot be added. I know I mentioned that on the previous slide, but it's that important to know. And the Speaker of the House, oh my God, one of the most influential, important speakers ever, Henry Clay. You thought you were done with him in A Push. Nope, talking about him in AP Gov. The Speaker of the House is incredibly powerful. They are third in line for the presidency. So if something happens to President and Vice President where they can't serve, Speaker of the House becomes the president. And Henry Clay was very influential in increasing the power of the Speaker. Sticking with the legislative branch, jumping over to the Senate. Special powers include, they approve presidential appointments and treaties. So again, any cabinet member, any judge that the president appoints, the Senate will approve or disapprove of them. And also treaties as well. Just because the president negotiates a treaty does not mean that treaty is final. The Senate has to approve it. They are also the jury in an impeachment trial. So the Senate will vote yes, that person should be removed, or no, they should not. There are 100 members and 2 per state. And the cloture motion, be able to identify this. This allows a filibuster to end where you can bring a bill to a vote. Now in the Senate, a filibuster happens when somebody is trying to delay the voting of a bill, and you are able to talk for as long as you want to try to delay voting. And the record of this is held by Strom Thurmond in 1957 when he spoke for over 24 consecutive hours. He was trying to filibuster or delay voting on a bill. That's why senators have much more influence over bills than do House of Representative members. Okay, so how do these elected officials vote in Congress? Well, if they take the delegate approach, then they vote according to how the majority of their constituents feel about an issue. If most people they represent feel one way, then they will vote that way. If they take the trustee view, then they will use their own views, or it could be based on the public good, not necessarily on the views of their constituents. So they could go against the views of their constituents if it is in conflict with their own views or what they think is best for the public. Okay, jumping on over to the executive branch. President, again, elected by the Electoral College, and they serve a 4-year term. 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms. 2-term, 22. That's how I remember it. Presidential powers include, they appoint judges, but as an example of checks and balances, they must be approved by the Senate. They are the commander-in-chief, and they can deploy troops without congressional consent, but there are some stipulations which we'll talk about more in a bit. They can veto bills. This is an example of checks and balances, and you're probably wondering, why is Grover Cleveland here? Well, he holds the record for the most vetoes in 1 term and also 2 terms. FDR has vetoed the most bills, but that's not really a fair comparison because FDR served for 3 terms and 3 months. And less than 10% of all vetoes are overridden. So it's very, very difficult to override a veto. Less than 10% have been overridden. And the threat of a veto can be very powerful in influencing legislation. So if the president doesn't like a bill, he or she can say to Congress, I will veto it, in hopes of getting Congress to change that bill. And vetoes are held up most often. In other words, they're not overridden when the president's party is in control of Congress. Now, the pocket veto, this is something that can be used if the president does nothing to a bill for 10 days, doesn't sign it, doesn't veto it, puts it in their pocket, and Congress is then adjourned, then it automatically is vetoed. And Lincoln did this with the Wade-Davis bill. He put that bill in his pocket, and then it was vetoed. And the president is also the head of his or her political party through custom and tradition. There's no mention of the president being the head of the political party in the Constitution. That's not a responsibility. That is something that has evolved over time. So executive orders, they do not need to be passed by Congress. And presidents have used them more frequently in recent years. Some famous executive orders include the Emancipation Proclamation, Japanese internment during World War II, and Truman desegregating the U.S. military during the Korean War. And they may be dependent on congressional funding, depending on what the executive order is. So it's not absolute power. They may be dependent on Congress for funding. And here is the probably most famous executive order, the Emancipation Proclamation. So every 4 years, there's a presidential nomination convention for both political parties in which nominees will vote for their candidate based on the primaries and caucuses. And delegates nominate the president. Now, if you're a delegate, you tend to be more ideological and more involved in politics than the general population. Now, be able to identify some powers that are not given to the president. I could see a question that would say all the following are powers given to the president except... And know that the president cannot line item a veto. Even though most governors can, the president cannot. So what the heck is a line item veto? Well, let's pretend here's a bill. And there are 3 parts to the bill. The president cannot say, I like 1 and 3, but I'm going to veto 2. The president either has to accept the bill in its entirety, or it has to veto the bill. The Supreme Court ruled on this and said that gives the president too much power. So they cannot, I repeat, cannot do a line item veto. They also cannot declare war. And they cannot create new cabinet positions or departments. That is Congress's job. Now, presidential staff, some names, some offices you should be familiar with. The White House staff, they are very loyal and supportive of the president. The National Security Advisor, this is the chief advisor to the president on national security issues. And the chief of staff is basically the president's personal secretary that meets with the president on a daily basis, sets up meetings, and is the president's most right-hand person. They are right next to them throughout the day most of the time. The chief of staff does not require Senate confirmation, so they can be fired at will by the president. The Attorney General, they are the leader of the Justice Department, or essentially the head attorney of the federal government. Now, inherent powers, be able to know this. These are powers that the president has that are not explicitly stated in the Constitution, but rather are inferred. An example of this is recognizing other governments, issues of immigration, or acquiring territory. So when Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory, that is an example of inherent powers. And cabinet members sometimes, they are torn between their departments and the president because they are the head of their department, but they also want to be on good terms with the president. So if the president is at odds with a certain department, that secretary of that cabinet could be torn between their department and the president. Now, over time, especially after World War II, the president has gained more power. This is because of the Cold War, and foreign policy has become much more important in the past half century. Government services for individuals has increased, and the president has taken on more of a role there. And also, whenever there's economic or domestic issues, Americans look to the president first. If the economy is bad, many Americans will look to the president and say, what are you going to do about it? When 9/11 happened, many people looked to the president and said, what are you going to do in response? Let's talk about the executive branch and Congress. The president can try to influence legislation. Again, they cannot or introduce a bill in Congress, but they can hope to influence. They can use the media. And this is known as the bully pulpit, in which Teddy Roosevelt really made famous. He saw the presidency as a platform to speak about certain issues and goals and agendas. So this is a way the president could go on the media and say, hey, here's my idea. Urge your Congress people to support this. And presidents use the media more effectively than other branches. Again, most people can identify who the president is, but maybe not necessarily a member of Congress or a member of the Supreme Court. And they can also use their political party if they have a majority in Congress. They can lean on their political party for support. And if the president is popular, that greatly increases their chance of getting legislation that they want passed. Now, the executive branch and the judicial branch. The president can appoint judges, and what influences a president to appoint certain judges is the president hopes to find somebody who agrees with their philosophy. Now, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. Once they are appointed and confirmed, they serve for life unless they are impeached and removed. And the reason for this is this desire to have them be independent of political pressure, so they can make unpopular decisions that they deem right. They don't need to be afraid about their job being dependent on decisions that they make. They are appointed by the president but are approved by the Senate. Again, that's an example of checks and balances. And most justices have a long track record prior to being appointed, and presidents know where they stand on certain issues. The president knows this judge either would support many of my ideas or would not. And a president can have a large impact after they are out of office based on appointments. Right now, April 2nd, 2016, the longest serving justice on the Supreme Court was appointed during President Reagan 28 years ago. So long after President Reagan left office, one of his appointees is still on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court caseload, you definitely need to know this. The court can choose to hear almost any case it wishes. Now, appellate courts are often the most common source, and most court cases are not reviewed by the Supreme Court. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands of court cases at the Supreme Court that people hope the Supreme Court will hear, and they only hear a fraction of them each year. When 4 judges on the Supreme Court, 4 out of 9 agree to hear a case, then the court can hear that case. Now, you need to know a district court and you need to know an appellate court. A district court deals with most federal cases. This is where federal cases occur. And most of these trials end in a plea bargain. That is the most common outcome. Most of these cases do not go to trial. They end in a plea bargain. Now, an appellate court, this is a court that can review decisions of district courts. So if you don't like your decision in a district court, you can appeal to an appellate court. Then the Supreme Court can choose a case from an appellate court if it wishes. Now, some terms you need to know, these Latin terms. Amicus curiae, this means friend of the court. Now, this allows interest groups to write letters to the Supreme Court detailing how a case would impact them. So for the landmark court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, there were dozens of groups that wrote amicus curiae briefs, basically telling the Supreme Court, here's how this decision would impact us. Now, the doctrine of original intent is looking at the Constitution based on the intention of the framers. So when all else fails, kind of figure out how would the framers of the Constitution view this? How would people like George Washington and Ben Franklin and Alexander Hamilton, what would they decide? The incorporation doctrine, holy cow, know this, whether it's incorporation doctrine, selective incorporation, or incorporation. You need to know this. This is so important in AP government. This is the idea that the Bill of Rights are applied to state governments. Originally, the Bill of Rights were interpreted to only apply to the federal government. An example, a court case that is an example of selective incorporation is Map versus Ohio, which we'll come back to. State decisis is Latin for let the decision stand, meaning that the Supreme Court often makes decisions based on precedent or previous decisions. So precedent or previous decisions is a very important idea for the Supreme Court. Now, if you can pronounce this, you're a better person than I am. Writs of certiorari, I can never pronounce that no matter how many times I hear it. This is the idea that the Supreme Court orders a case from a lower court to be reviewed. So they may say, I don't like that decision of that court. You're coming up here. We're going to hear this and settle this once and for all. Judicial restraint is the belief that the Supreme Court should rely on precedent in making decisions, and this advocates less court involvement in legislation. Again, know these terms, they're bolded. If you have to make flashcards, do that. Judicial activism is the belief that the Supreme Court can correct injustices where perhaps legislation has not. An example of this is Brown versus the Board of Education, which desegregated schools. Now, Supreme Court and free speech. Free speech can be limited if it poses a clear and present danger test. And this was established in the 1919 court case, Schenck versus the United States. Be able to identify that clear and present danger, which was coined by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Here he is with his sweet mustache, and here he is 30 years earlier. He still got that same mustache. Isn't that crazy? That's like a 30-year difference. Free speech also extends beyond the use of words, and the court has declared that free speech can include flag burning or burning of the American flag, and also wearing an armband to protest, say, the Vietnam War, which is what Tinker versus the Des Moines School District was all about. Some important court cases to know. Marbury versus Madison. Here's Marbury. He was really upset that he didn't get his papers, so he sued Secretary of State James Madison. This established the principle of judicial review. Every single test, Marbury and Judicial has been on it. This is the idea that the court can overturn laws, executive orders, state laws, and lower court decisions. And John Marshall, the Chief Justice, said it is emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is. So it's up to the Supreme Court to determine the constitutionality of laws. McCulloch v. Maryland, this was from 1819. Maryland was taxing a branch of the Bank of the United States, and it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court stated that states could not tax a federal government agency. And what we see is that this reinforces the elastic or the necessary and proper clause that Hamilton used to create the bank. And this also increases the power of the federal government over the states. This is a big theme of John Marshall's court. Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This established the separate but equal doctrine. Supreme Court stated that segregation was legal as long as facilities were equal. The only dude who voted against this decision, who dissented against this decision, was this guy, John Marshall Harlan. He said this is a very bad decision. And this was later overturned by Brown versus Board. Miranda versus Arizona in 1960s. This states that suspects must have their constitutional rights read to them. The idea of the Fifth Amendment. If you read the Fifth Amendment, it says you have the right to not testify against yourself. So you have the right to remain silent during police investigations. Do you know your Miranda rights? Can you say them right now? And don't you dare say you have the right to be an attorney. The Warren Court from 1953 to 1969 that included the Miranda versus Arizona, included the board, Brown versus the Board of Education, many important court cases, and whether it's desegregating schools, the exclusionary rule of Map versus Ohio. This is an example of selective incorporation. In Ohio, the police in Ohio illegally seized evidence from Doll Ree Map's home, and they used it against her in court. And what the Supreme Court said was, you know what? You can't. You, the state government, are not allowed to use illegally seized evidence against her. So this established the exclusionary rule and is applying the Fourth Amendment of the Bill of Rights to the states. And also we see attorneys for individuals with low incomes that if you do not have a lot of money, you are guaranteed an attorney. That's Gideon versus Wainwright. This also happened under the Warren Court. Miranda versus Arizona. Again, there's your Miranda warning in case you didn't know it. And abortion was not part of the Warren Court. This happens in 1973. So don't be tricked if you see abortion lumped in with the Warren Court on examples of Warren Court decisions. Abortion was not one of them. Griswold versus Connecticut. This allowed or legalized contraception. This overturned a Connecticut law that prohibited it. And the Supreme Court argued that the Constitution contained a right to privacy. Be able to identify this, the right to privacy. 8 years later in Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court legalized abortion, and they also cited a person's right to privacy. Now in 1974 in U.S. versus Nixon, Nixon had these tapes from his Oval Office when the Watergate scandal was going on that he did not want to share. And the Supreme Court said, you got to turn those over, bro. Executive privilege is not absolute. You're kind of acting like a king here, and you have to turn those tapes over. Baker versus Carr established the idea of one person, one vote, which deals with gerrymandering, and you're not allowed to have one district essentially have more power than another. And state legislature districts have to be as close to equal as possible. Gitlow versus New York in 1925. This is the court case that began selective incorporation, so definitely know that bad boy. New York Times versus Sullivan. Here's the New York Times. This was in 1964. The Supreme Court said that if you're a public official, you have to prove malice or intentional harm or intentional lying if you're trying to win a lawsuit for defamation. So if you're a public figure and you claim that somebody slanders you, it's a lot harder to prove. The Supreme Court and the death penalty, they've kind of changed their mind over the years, but in recent years they've stated that it is not necessarily a violation of the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual punishment. So the death penalty is okay, according to the Supreme Court. Now, federal budget, let's talk about. Entitlements. This is the largest portion of uncontrollable spending. Entitlements include things like Social Security and Medicaid. And the baby boom generation is and will be drawing from Social Security. So that spending is going to increase. I hope John Doe doesn't mind I gave his Social Security number out. And there's a lower ratio of people paying into Social Security today than when it began. So that's a problem. Less money going in, more money being drawn. The Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, it's bolded. You got to know this. This prepares the federal budget. And the major predictor for funding for an agency, the single largest predictor, when the budget comes out and how they're going to allocate money, is they look to last year's budget. How much did an agency get last year? That's the starting point for this year's budget. The bureaucracy, this is government agencies that implement policies, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency or the Food and Drug Administration. That is an example of the bureaucracy. And they receive mandates from Congress and funding. So they are told guidelines and essentially how to, what policies they have to carry out, and they receive funding. And then they create guidelines to carry out those mandates. This is part of that iron triangle I talked about earlier. Do you remember the other two parts? Don't look back. Congress and interest groups, look at you, you little genius. So some important amendments to know. First Amendment, there's 5 parts of it. Freedom of religion, press, assembly, petition, speech, know all 5. You might encounter the Establishment Clause, which says that Congress shall not establish an official religion. That's in the First Amendment. So the Establishment Clause prohibits Congress from establishing an official religion. The Free Exercise Clause says that Congress shall not prohibit the free exercise of religion. So it really limits Congress's or the federal government's ability to interfere with your practice of a religion. But that doesn't mean you can do something illegal. The Supreme Court has ruled you can't do illegal drugs, for example, if you claim it's a part of your religion. 14th Amendment, this is your Citizenship and Equal Protection Amendment, and this is what selective incorporation is based on, the 14th Amendment. I hope you got that so far from this video. Now let's talk about some democracy-related amendments. 15 is suffrage for adult males, but we know that the South got around that when it came to African Americans with poll taxes and literacy tests. 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. 19th Amendment is women's suffrage, and the 23rd Amendment provided 3 electoral votes for those people living in Washington, D.C. Because it's not a state, up until the 23rd Amendment, if you lived in D.C., you couldn't vote in a presidential election. 24th Amendment eliminated poll taxes, and the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18. Now, quick recap. What happened when that voting age was lowered? 18-year-olds, did they vote in large numbers? No, because the younger you are, the less likely you are to vote. Some important acts to note. Civil Rights Act of 1964, wicked important. Here's LBJ. Here's Martin Luther King right over his shoulder. This guaranteed equal access to public accommodations. In other words, segregation and discrimination is now illegal. The government could cut off funds where discrimination occurred. If a state continued to allow for discrimination, federal government would cut off funds. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is incredibly important as well. And this stated that the federal government could register voters in areas where minorities are not registered in large numbers. And this also eliminated literacy tests for voting. The War Powers Act is such an important act. If you know almost no other act, know this because it has been on many, many, many exams. This limits the president's ability to commit troops to conflict. And this is kind of a response to the Vietnam War, in which the presidents were escalating the Vietnam War. So what this does is it says that the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of sending troops to an area. And those troops cannot stay for longer than 60 days unless Congress gives the okay or gives an extension. And this limits the ability of the president to commit troops. Absolutely no, the War Powers Act. Now, motor voter laws allow for voter registration opportunities. They must be provided when applying or renewing a license. So when you are renewing your license or you're applying for a license, if you're 18, guess what? You can go to the DMV and register to vote there. All right, we are also close to the end. Important terms of the coalition building. This is the idea of groups coming together to achieve a goal or to achieve the passage of a law or some sort of public policy. Divided government, we talked about it earlier, but this is the idea that Congress is controlled by a political party that the president is not a member of. Now let's take a look here. We see that FDR, when he was president, it's all blue. That means Congress, both the Senate and the House, was then controlled by the Democrats, and FDR was a Democrat. So Truman, we see some divided government during his term, and Dwight Eisenhower's as well. But what we notice is in recent years, there's a lot more divided government. And this can also include the House and Senate being controlled by different political parties, making the passage of laws more difficult. So what's the impact of divided government? Again, compromise is more difficult. We have an increase in gridlock and things are not getting done. And this helps lead to frustration or increased distrust with the government. And I can't stress enough, divided government has been more frequent since the 1970s. This has been increasing in recent years. Know that. All right, you hear this term civil rights. This is the idea of protecting individuals or groups from discrimination, not allowing discrimination to happen. And an example of that is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, civil liberties, this is the idea of protecting individuals from government actions. An example of that is the Bill of Rights. So know the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. Make a flashcard, make flashcards of them if you have to. Some important elections. Really, I would tell you know all of them between 1796 and 2012. I'm only kind of kidding. A couple that you must know no matter what. Election of 1932, we have FDR and the New Deal. And we see here that Roosevelt is overwhelmingly elected. He just pretty much destroys Herbert Hoover. Now, from this moment forward, we have a political realignment. African Americans, Jews, and the working class, they began to vote predominantly Democratic. Definitely no African Americans that they predominantly vote Democratic. The election of 1968 with Nixon, we see another political realignment in which southern states or whites began to vote Republican. So let's look here at Reagan in 1980. Oh, let's look at the South. We see lots of Republican in 1980. So with Reagan, we see this continued political realignment and an increase in conservative Christians supporting the Republicans. So the far right or religious conservative Christians will support the Republican Party, and that really begins in 1980. So if you know no other elections, know 1932, 1968, and 1980. All right, guys, that's it. If you've lasted this long, bless you. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I hope this video helps. Make sure you know these terms. You will encounter them on your test. I promise you, you will do great, and you are always more than a test score. Please come back and let me know if this video was helpful. And I wish you nothing but the most success. And I thank you guys very much for watching and your support. And have a good day.